Hey, welcome to the Art and Science of AI, a podcast about the science of how AI works and the art of using AI to reimagine your life, business, and society. I'm Nikhil and I'm one of your co-hosts. I'm an AI product manager, and I love helping people learn about AI.
I'm Piyush, your other co-host. I'm a AI sales executive, and I love learning about AI and talking about AI. Nikhil, what's going on in the world of AI?
Yeah, so interestingly, a lot of stuff's been going on with the company you work at, Google. In the last episode a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about AI news, we talked a lot about Meta, Apple, and OpenAI. There were a lot of announcements last month around that. But Google has been in the news in a big way for the past week or so. A couple of things have been going on that I want to talk about. One is their recent event announcing the Pixel phones and the associated AI features. And second is there's been some legal case against Google in the US, an antitrust case that I think is worth talking about.
Yeah, folks want to break up Google, man. I don't
Yeah,
feel so good about it being an employee of Google, but
that's
it is what
true.
it is, I guess.
I mean, I don't think it should impact employees and shareholders. I was actually reading that the last major antitrust breakup like this, which was of Rockefeller's companies, like the oil companies that he had back in the 19th, 20th centuries, after the breakup, the combined valuation of the broken up companies like was way higher than the single company. And so
That's
anyway,
a good point. A good argument can be made that YouTube outside of Google, not that the way they will be broken up will be Google separate, YouTube separate, but YouTube outside of Google could easily be valued at $1 trillion, maybe at least like a $500 billion. And I don't know how much of that is baked into Google's valuation. So, wow, in like a minute now, you made me feel better about the breakup. Anyways, let's
Let's
talk
start
about
with
that
the
event.
Pixel.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
the Pixel event. So Google had their Pixel event, which is the equivalent of Apple's iPhone event. And I think on everyone's minds is Apple Intelligence, which came out a couple of months ago. So, when Google talks about their new um, phones and features, everyone's wondering about like what's going on with AI. So in the event, they announced obviously their hardware also. So they announced updates to Google Pixel phone, the Pixel Watch, and the Pixel Buds, which are the earbuds. But in addition to that, like the star of the show was kind of their AI announcements, which were a through line through all of these different devices. And yeah, the AI kind of works across all the devices. And for the purposes of our podcast, I think let's skip over the hardware stuff. That's not what we're focused on, and let's talk about what AI stuff they announced.
Yeah, sounds interesting. Let's talk about it. I mean, you'd think that being a Google employee, I would know exactly what's going on, but there's like, it's a giant company and there's so many announcements that are happening. There's so
Yeah,
many events. Like, I have enough news and events to keep up within the advertising ecosystem. I don't always get a chance. So I'm actually, it's weird, but I'm looking forward to hearing what my company announced recently on AI from you.
true. This happens to me also, especially when Meta announces VR and metaverse hardware. Often I just find out about it through the news. And I mean, I could be following this internally, but yeah, we both work at companies that are just so big that there's not enough time in the day for me to follow everything that's going on
Yeah,
everywhere.
for sure.
So, right. So first we said that they launched their hardware and then there are the AI features. So I think the most interesting AI feature they announced is this thing called Gemini Live. So Gemini is the Google AI model, or it's the brand of their various AI models. And this new thing they announced called Gemini Live is basically a real-time interaction that you can have with Gemini using voice, and it simultaneously has access to things like your camera, your screen, and various information from your apps. So it's kind of like what ChatGPT OpenAI announced a couple of months ago about voice mode. where remember they got into this controversy
Scarlett
with
Johansson.
Scarlett Johansson,
Yeah.
yeah, about that. So that was the real-time voice capabilities that they announced, which actually has not yet been rolled out. They've claimed that they've started rolling it out in some kind of testing, but I haven't seen that, and I haven't heard of anyone who's seen that yet. So we're still waiting for
It
that.
actually reminds me more of what Apple announced because you said three very important things, right? It will have access to your camera, the app. So I think it's you're right. The voice mode is very similar to what OpenAI announced. But as you were saying those things, my mind was going to our discussion around the Apple Intelligence episode, right? Like it sounds like
Yeah.
it's like one of those inbuilt within the operating system type AI things, which can seamlessly bring information from apps, from hardware, obviously, like camera, mic, or whatnot, and like be your
Yes, absolutely. I think they are competing with Apple Intelligence here, but the one big thing that's missing in what they announced is integration with third-party apps. So unfortunately, they haven't announced anything around that yet. There are rumors that they will announce something, but so far, everything they announced. So remember when we talked about Apple, we talked about different categories of announcements they made. One was around better AI in Apple's apps, like in mail, photos, messages, and those kind of apps. And then there's AI in Siri, and the AI in Siri can work with Apple's apps, but it can also work with third-party apps. And they released developer frameworks for developers to integrate with that. In this case, we Google has announced making their apps smarter, and they've announced that the assistant is going to get smarter with Gemini, but it's from what we've seen, it's limited to only Google's apps. So it can give you answers if you have questions about things where the answers are in your Gmail or in Google Maps or in YouTube or somewhere. It can give you those answers, but if your questions about something in WhatsApp or anything outside of Google, like it's not going to be able to work with that. So
yeah.
I think we should watch out and see what they are going to announce for that because I do think they have to offer something there. Otherwise, it's just like not going to be as
Yeah,
competitive
but as
as
far as
Apple
starting off
Intelligence.
with proprietary apps, the good thing is the Google's ecosystem has such an insane list of proprietary apps with such high usage that even starting off with just Google ecosystem is not a bad place to start with. Like just I think there are now it's hard to keep count, but over 10 property or 15 Google properties that have over 500 million users monthly, and some
Wow.
six Google properties that have more than 2 billion users monthly. Like, for example, Maps, Gmail, Chrome, Play Store, like all of these are the big properties, but then
Yeah.
there's like a long list of things like Google Photos, whatnot. So even within this ecosystem of 15 properties, I think it can make for like a really good integrated AI, right? Like, hey, pull my photos from this thing, or like connect some email with the calendar, and like, am I free? I think there was one demo that did trickle down to my consciousness, and it was a failed demo.
Oh yeah.
Did you get a
Yeah.
chance to watch?
Yeah, so I actually watched it and they had to try doing the demo like two or three times
Yeah,
before it succeeded. It was a demo of this Gemini thing, and I think that's because previously they did a demo that was not live and they got a lot of criticism for that, saying that, hey, they were deceiving the audience into
right, right.
showcasing some capabilities that were not real. So I think it's fine. Like, I mean, people
Yeah, no, I
understand
mean, I
that
wasn't
things
so much
fail.
talking about like the failed aspect of the demo, but like what they were trying to achieve in that demo was something like, hey, like see if I'm free on this evening when
Yes,
this
exactly.
concert is.
So in the demo, what they were doing was they were looking at a concert schedule. I forgot
Right,
if they took a photo of the concert schedule or if they pulled it up on a website. One of
right.
those things. In either case, the Gemini assistant can answer that question and interact with it, whether it's on your screen or whether you took a photo of it. So it was some concert, and then the person asks to check their calendar to see if they're free on the date of the concert, and it checks the calendar and says, hey, you're free. And then
Right.
they ask to create a reminder to buy the concert tickets.
Yeah.
And it integrates with the Google Calendar to check whether they're free. And then Google has a reminders or tasks app where it adds this item to remind you to go and
It's
buy
very cool.
tickets.
Yeah. It is
Yeah,
actually really something like an assistant would do for a person who can afford an assistant, right? Like, hey, like this
yeah.
this artist that my daughter likes, just check if like they're coming to our city and if I'm free in that day. And then you just assume that the assistant will then like search for the dates and then find out, look at your calendar. It's kind of cool. And I imagine that this is what originally the name assistant, that's why the name assistant was added to Google Assistant, but it's kind of surprising that we're going with the Gemini branding here.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, absolutely. I think these capabilities are really cool. On the branding, yeah, that I can't answer. I think Gemini is the AI brand, and
Yeah,
they could have chosen to just say Google Assistant, now powered by AI, but I think it sounds cooler if they say Gemini. But
Gemini
essentially,
Live.
you can replace your Google Assistant with Gemini now. I don't know if that
I'm not allowed to
is.
share this, but I've been dog fooding it. So for those
Ah,
of you
okay.
who don't know what dog fooding is, it's basically employees internally at Google can get access to early features. So I have been dog fooding Gemini as my Google Assistant, and it's pretty neat. Like with Google Assistant, I would barely use it with just what's the weather like, set an alarm, stuff like that. Just stuff that I could do manually even, but I choose the assistant because it's just a voice command. But with Gemini as the assistant, like you can ask it more complex questions. It's almost like you're prompting your AI.
Right.
But that's different than Gemini Live though. Like I think Gemini Live is just a more
Well,
natural.
before we get into Gemini Live, it's interesting that you mentioned this, that you were able to do only basic things earlier, like setting an alarm or checking the weather, and now you can do more advanced things. But one of the common complaints I've been seeing from users is that now you can do more advanced things, but you
But you
can't do
can't do
the
the
basic
basic things.
things.
Yeah. So what's annoying is I can't turn on and off my like I have to do that
And
with
you
my
can't set
previous
a
application.
timer, like basic functionality, like, hey, set a
Yeah.
timer for
Yeah.
5 minutes. You can't do it.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the whole idea with dog fooding is like you. I mean, I do give a lot of feedback as well. Like, and one of the feedback has been is like, yes, a lot smarter, but not able to do some things that a dumb version could
yeah.
do.
So apparently, this is a really hard problem to solve, which is how do you do both the simple things and the hard things? Because for the simple things, you don't want to route it to this LLM. You just want a
Right.
simple deterministic program to set the timer for you. But then for some complex queries, you do want to route it to the LLM. Just solving this challenge is incredibly complex. So one of my best friends who works on Amazon Alexa was telling me this because he's trying to solve this problem for Alexa. I've been trying to convince him to come on this podcast for a while, but I have been
That would be
unsuccessful.
an interesting thing to talk about. Yeah, you should.
Yeah, if I can get him on, we should talk about it. But yeah, he's been actually trying to solve this exact challenge for Alexa, which
Why?
is
Well, I
how.
mean, again, just not knowing much about this, why couldn't you use the same kind of architecture that you described that Apple may be using? Is like there's something that uses the judgment on where to send it, right? You said something to that effect when we're talking about Apple Intelligence, that it has
Mhm.
some kind of an architecture where first a judgment is applied to what needs to be used. So, like, why couldn't there be
Yeah,
something
so
that,
first you have an orchestrator
yeah,
model or agent that determines where to route your request and whether it
right,
needs to be routed. Um, I think something like that is the answer, but the main challenge is that so if that router or orchestrator agent is an LLM based agent, the thing is it is very difficult to get consistent outputs from any type of LLM application right now. So
right,
that's one of the main challenges. If I want consistent structured output,
yeah,
is very challenging. It requires a lot of finesse in crafting the prompt, in using things, advanced tool capabilities of LLMs like function calling, and that's one of the hardest things that like we have not solved yet. So LLMs are great for things like chatting, having natural language conversations, but when you want them to behave like a computer program and do something deterministic or quasi-deterministic, like providing structured outputs and routing, that's where it's a hard problem to solve, and we haven't figured it
interesting.
out yet. Yeah, if we can get Jay on here, like he can tell us more about it. But until then, it's the same problem Google is facing, and so they've released this. Gemini Live does a bunch of cool things. So yeah, the live part of this is that it's real time. It's very low latency. You can have a conversation with it. You can interrupt it right in the moment. You can show new context to it. So suppose you have your camera open and you're chatting with it, you can move the camera to something else and say, hey, tell me what this is now. Or if you are chatting with it based on what's on your screen, you can like scroll your screen to the next page or to a different website and keep asking it questions like, hey, what's on this website, then what's on the next page, and things like that. So it's like imagine your assistant has access to your eyes and ears
Yeah.
somehow. So it can see what you're seeing, can hear what you're hearing, and it has access to information in your app. So like the calendar example that we saw. And
Yeah.
one other thing they announced was that it's also going to be able to capture history and have memory through screenshots. So if you take screenshots of things you want to remember, um, then you can go back and ask it just when you're chatting with it. You can say like, "Oh, hey, tell me about this thing I saw yesterday." This is kind of like Microsoft Recall, where Microsoft was automatically taking screenshots of your screen periodically, so that if you just want to remember something that happened yesterday, you're like, "Oh, hey, I saw an interesting product on Amazon, but I totally forgot what it was. Tell me about it." It'll tell you that. I I think right now the way Google has implemented it, you have to manually take those screenshots. Maybe in future they'll have some automated way of doing that as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, those were the updates to Gemini, and it's pretty cool. Like I'm excited to try it out, or like maybe when I'm an Apple user, but you use Android and Pixel, so I don't know when you get the next phone. When are you due for an upgrade of your phone?
I am actually. I have a 7 Pro and this one was 9 or 9 Pro. So yeah, I think I'm
Okay,
overdue an update.
cool.
I'm
Well,
actually looking
if
forward to it myself.
all right. Yeah. Well, we can talk more about your experience with it when you get it. So that's most of the announcements on Gemini. They also announced a bunch of cool features using Gemini in the apps. Like one is in the Photos app. They announced some cool things. Magic Editor is a feature where you can modify images of photos that you took. So you can say you took a photo of me like just like this, you could get it to modify the background and say, hey, put me in like a different room. You could get it to do things like change my hoodie color from red to yellow, remove my
Do
headphones.
you think all this is also happening through LLMs or is this Gemini now seems to be the everything branding for AI? Because
These
these
are image generation models, so similar to Midjourney and Dolly, which we were using earlier, but like now they're integrated into the chatbots. So, for example, if you're using ChatGPT, it can do image generation for you. It's calling an image generation model on the back end. But what the ultimate goal that all these models are trying to get to is what's called a multimodal model.
hmm hmm
Multimodal means it supports multiple modalities. A modality here is like text, image, audio, video. So these are the four primary modalities. There are primarily three. You can say video is just a combination of image and audio, but it's a different modality. So all of these ultimately are going to converge to multimodal models where it's not just text in, text out. Like the models we use today that we're familiar with, like ChatGPT, Gemini, those are typically called text to text models, where the input is text and the output is text. And often what they're doing is in the back end, they're calling some other image generation model. So that's called a text to image model. And then there are like image to image models as well. But ultimately, the holy grail that people want to get to is multimodal to multimodal models, where you can input anything between text, image, audio, video, and you can get the output in any of those formats that you want.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That's going to be very, very interesting, the world to live in, where you have like this insanely capable multimodal model, basically.
And it's really complex to do that because remember in the first season, we talked about how these text models work. They create an abstract representation of the text in like a vector embedding space. So they're creating representations of your words and sentences. So now what's happening is that this representation space captures not only text, but it also captures images and videos. And they need to make a common representation space that just understands meaning behind anything, whether it's a text or image or video. And that
Yeah,
actually is a
basically what
really,
humans do, right? Like I'm guessing. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the goal. I think increasingly it's very obvious to me that the goal is to bring human-like capabilities, right? Like we're multimodal beings. We can hear
yeah.
stuff, we can read stuff, we can, and our output can be in like voice
We
or
can't
written.
directly output like images and video, unfortunately. But yeah, I
Well,
think you can, in your
we
mind, maybe
can.
you can.
Yeah, I mean, the way we output them would be like through a sketch, but you know what I mean? Like that
Yeah.
would be our output modality of an image.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's the maybe so perhaps some advanced models of AI would also have touch as a modality or like an
Hmm.
understanding of, I don't know, what is it called technically, haptic? Like there, I
Hmm.
know some of the meta, like I don't know if there's haptic feedback in the most recent Oculus, what is it called now?
Oh,
What's
it's
the
been there
branding?
from the beginning. One of my favorite games that I play on my Oculus is VR table tennis, and it is the most realistic experience I have. So the controller is like the table tennis racket. When you hit the ball, it gives you haptic feedback. It buzzes, and you know that you hit the ball. And if you hit it at different levels of intensity, if you hit it harder, it gives you harder feedback. If you hit it with spin, it gives you a different kind of feedback. So that's already there. I'm not sure how that gets integrated into AI. That's an interesting topic, though. And
Yeah.
for the metaverse, that would be really cool. And there's also like smell, for example, like smell and touch. Yeah, these are the two things that are
Yeah, because I mean,
remaining.
I imagine there'll be some sensors in your phone eventually where you'll be like, what is it that I smell? Hey, Gemini, what do I smell? What's that weird smell? And or
Yeah,
potentially like it could smell some dangerous stuff. So there's like some good implementations of like, I smell carbon monoxide. I don't know if carbon monoxide has a smell. Maybe it's not detectable to humans, but it will be to the AI.
yeah,
So
or a
yeah,
gas leak or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And for touch, I think typically one simple way you could do it is you could wear like a glove that has sensors on it, and you could touch something and it would tell you. I mean, that would just be additional information. Say I'm looking at a tree and like, hey, I want to learn more about this tree, and like if you can touch it, it understands the texture, the contours of the
Yeah,
tree, and it's just more information. So
right.
yeah, I
So the
don't know if.
more modalities you add, basically you get a more complete picture
Hmm.
of the world that we inhabit. And that's
Yeah.
hopefully the goal. If you said that the goal is to build an abstract representation, with the text to text model, it was just in text, right? But
Yeah.
our abstract representation of the world is not in one modality. It's in the combination of like different modalities, like what we
Right.
discussed. So perhaps the goal eventually would be to build a system or a model that has an abstract representation of the world that we inhabit in the
Hmm.
well, actually these are the modalities that are applicable to us, right? The five modalities like touch, smell, but maybe there are other modalities that are outside of the human
Yeah.
space and you could add them to the model. Even I can't even imagine what that model would be
Yeah.
like.
And even within the modalities that we have sensory consciousness of, we only have a limited range. For
Right,
example, hearing, there's a limited range of frequencies we can hear, whereas dogs have a different range of frequencies. That's why you can have something like a dog whistle, which a human cannot hear, but like a dog can.
right.
So yeah, I think ultimately maybe AI will have more sensory consciousness than even humans can. I don't know.
Yeah.
That would be interesting.
There's we digress, but like to just to close the point, a lot of times people when they talk about AGI and how when there'll be an AGI and it will be on this takeoff of intelligence explosion, it will have an IQ that is different to humans in the same way how human IQ is different from ants. And it's always hard to put that into perspective in my head. But this conversation, I
Yeah.
think, helps me put that into perspective. It's like, look, we have five modalities, and to your point, even there we have a limited bandwidth, right? Like our consciousness is only limited. I think some philosopher did some analogy, and he said that we can only process certain amount of bits, whereas there's like gigabits or terabits of data that we
Mm,
could potentially process, like our consciousness could be expanded. So not only can it expand, and I guess the analogy would be like context window, like, and which is just increasing day by day. That would be like the short term conscious that we have. Like not only would that be expanded, which we have obviously an example of like expanding context windows, but even the modalities would be more than the five that humans have access to. So that maybe gives us some perspective into why this entity AGI will be so different to us in its intelligence, how we are to ants, maybe even worse, or more, when I say worse, maybe even more difference in orders of
yeah,
magnitude.
I can't even picture what that would be like, but I'm curious and that's exciting.
Right.
So,
Well,
let's wrap up the
these are
Google.
the seeds, or these are the early developments that will eventually lead into that. So it's which is why I feel like the space is so exciting because we're witnessing something remarkable. Uh,
Yeah. And so far, all this stuff that we're seeing is focused only on the digital world because AI interacts primarily with the digital world. So that's why we don't see much about like touch and smell. It's mostly just like image, text, videos because that's what we interact with. But I think as metaverse advances with things like augmented reality, mixed reality, virtual reality, that's also going to spur innovations in these other modalities that you're talking about as we're breaking down the barriers between the digital world and the physical world. So I think that's a next boundary. And yeah, I'm curious to see what more mixed reality devices and hardware are coming out. Yeah. So let's wrap up this Google event. I think that we covered most of it. A couple of other features. So we talked about photos having magic editor. They now have this feature called like Add Me, which is if you want to take a photo with like a group of people and you don't want to take a selfie and you don't have anyone else to take it with you, they let you take a photo without you in it. And then you can go and stand in the empty spot and ask someone else to take a photo with you in it, and then it'll stitch both of those together to add you into a group photo. It's kind of gimmicky, but I think it's an interesting feature. And the last thing was they have call notes now. So you can set it up such that all your phone calls will automatically be transcribed and you will have summaries of those saved onto your phone.
that's a good one. As long as
Yeah.
it's like designed with privacy in mind, I think that could be a good one to have.
Yeah, privacy and consent, I think. So they
Right.
talked about how they're going to make sure that it's announced and disclosed to everyone on the call that it's being recorded. And I think it's also just being saved on your device and not going to any cloud. So it
Mhm.
is private. Let's jump to the other topic, which is so the other reason Google has been in the news this last week is because a US judge ruled that Google is a monopolist in an antitrust case. So apparently, Google has a monopoly over the search advertising market. I'm not sure exactly what the definition of the market they used is, but they declared that Google is a monopoly. And once you're a monopolist, there's certain kind of behavior that you cannot engage in. And one example of that kind of behavior is making exclusive deals and partnerships. So in this case, the most relevant thing here, which we've discussed in this podcast in the past, is that Google has a deal with Apple for being the default search provider on Apple's iPhone device's default browser, which is Safari. So by default, whenever anyone gets an iPhone and they open Safari and they search for something, that's a Google search. And for that privilege, Google pays Apple around 30% of all the revenue that they get from the searches. And that translates today to about $20 billion per year, which is huge for
Insane.
Apple. Yeah, and it for Apple, it's pure profit. It has
Yeah.
zero cost associated with
In
it.
fact, they outsource the cost of having a great search engines on iPhone to Google. Like all the processing needed, whatever processing is needed is done by Google, and
Yeah,
they get paid for it. That's
yeah.
amazing.
So this is the power of controlling distribution. Like
Right.
Apple controls the distribution. They have the consumers on there, And once you control the distribution, then you can make deals with suppliers and just take a cut out of whatever money suppliers are making. And that's exactly what they're
Right.
doing. But in this case, a judge ruled that it was illegal. So that has to get killed. I mean, of course, they will appeal it and there will be a whole appeals process, but let's assume for the moment that this ruling stands. Um, let's think about like what happens here. This is actually pretty interesting, and it has interesting implications for AI because, as we talked about in the Apple Intelligence episode, what Apple is currently doing with Google with search is the same thing that they're trying to do with AI, where they're saying that, hey, we won't provide um, all the AI capabilities ourselves. We'll let other people like OpenAI and other providers provide it. And we'll just take, I mean, they didn't officially announce anything about like how much money they're taking, but I think most people assume that it's a similar arrangement that someone can bid to be the default like AI provider for Apple and they'll pay them a cut.
That's a very
And
interesting perspective. I didn't think about it like that, but now that you mention it, yeah, that's a very, very interesting perspective, and I kind of agree with you. That's very smart, actually. Just to repeat, so what the arrangement that exists between Apple and Google for Google search or for search,
mhm.
you're saying the same, you can use the same analogy or almost exactly the same thing is happening for AI now, where OpenAI could be the Google equivalent of AI.
Yes.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay, interesting.
So when they announced it in the Apple
Why not, right?
Intelligence,
Sorry to interrupt you, but why not? This is such a great arrangement, like we just said, $20 billion of pure profit.
yeah.
This is amazing. So why not use it for AI even?
So the risk of it is that you don't, as a company, you don't want to outsource what is like really important to your
Mm.
customer's experience. And if it turns out that this AI thing is really important and they outsource that, that could be a risk for Apple in future. Because ultimately, like maybe it'll get to a point where people don't care about the device anymore. They're like, I just want the best AI. And they're like, well, now, whichever device offers the AI assistant that I want, I'll go use that device. So that's the risk for Apple in future, that they could become obsolete. And I think actually I don't know much about China, but from what I've heard, there they have these like super apps like WeChat,
Yeah.
for example, which is almost everything.
Which is what
And
Elon Musk is trying to do with X. Like that's his vision with X. He wants to make like the first super app in the Western world.
Hmm. And so one thing that the risk of allowing super apps is that your platform and device kind of becomes irrelevant. If you're just like, hey, everything I need to do is on WeChat, then I don't care what device or what platform I do that on. So that's the risk. But before getting to AI, let's actually think about what happens here now that this deal is dead. There are like a bunch of interesting possibilities and many questions that are raised. So one is
Actually, I
like,
have a POV on this. So
yeah.
one of the reasons why you have such strong anti-competition laws is to prevent users or consumers from exploitation, right? And the
Hmm.
idea was traditionally that, let's say, if a company that makes, I don't know, baby formula had a monopoly, they could start price gouging, and it's not fair to consumers to prevent monopolistic behavior or like companies from attributing monopolistic behavior. However, in the case of digital or like this doesn't just apply to Google, right? Like a lot of people say Apple is
So,
monopolistic
by the way, just
or
before you
Amazon.
go there, to this, what you just described, in the legal terminology, it is known as the consumer harm standard. And
Okay.
this has kind of defined US antitrust law for the past few decades, which is they judge everything on the standard of consumer harm. Is
Right.
this going to harm consumers or benefit consumers? And if they find that it's going to harm consumers, then they try to curtail that kind of behavior.
Right.
But over the past 5 to 10 years or so, there's been a shift. There's been a new administration, and this person, Lena Khan, who heads the FTC, has pursued a more aggressive antitrust um, policy where they're saying even if there is no consumer harm right now, we still, in principle, want to prevent large companies from having excessive amounts of power because of potential like future harm that they could cause, or just because we don't want entities to be like so powerful that they're preventing competition or they're amassing too much political power and various other reasons.
Yeah, so actually that's the point I was going to make is I agree that there could be other types of harm, but whenever people think of monopoly and the harm that it causes, it's generally if you ask anyone on the street, they will say, yeah, it's to prevent consumer harm. But in this case, what's interesting to me is it might actually have the opposite effect because a lot of these companies, because of their economies of scale, are able to provide amazing services for essentially for free. Like a lot of people
Yeah.
would say, what is and I know there's argument to be made on both sides, but for most people, they'll be like, Google's amazing. I get this amazing search engine for free. I get email for free. I get maps for free. Like these are amazing. People depend on these services daily. Like there's a very famous principle that Larry Page had in order to like shut down a potential business idea internally, and he called it the toothbrush principle. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Hmm.
And his framework was whatever you're pitching, does it have the potential to be used at least twice a day, like a toothbrush would be? Because that's something that I'm interested in. Not that he was saying that all businesses that don't meet the two principles are like
But
not a
for
good idea,
Google
or
scale,
for
that's
Larry
what they,
Page, right? On Google
yeah.
scale or for Larry Page to be like interested or excited about it, it should meet that. And like a lot of these services which are for free, like more than meet the toothbrush criteria, like Google search, Google Maps. So I'm curious, like, how do you think about that? Like, because when you try to intervene or regulate these things, it might end up having the opposite effect. Because when they lose the economies of scale, maybe the service quality would go down, and no one was being charged for it anyways. So now uh, consumers would potentially be charged for something which was either free or get a substandard quality service.
I absolutely agree. I think this is just a very complex issue. I don't have any like easy answer for this, but I think one thing that people are converging on now is that look, consumer harm is not the only standard that we can apply. There are other effects that we have to consider, like maybe just market dominance, they're killing competition, and it's just maybe like dangerous for a single company to have like so much power in a democratic society. So I don't know. It's like a very complex issue, but it's really evolving because I think this is one of the first times in history where these companies have like probably a lot more power than any governments right now. Like decisions that are made by companies like Apple, Meta, Google are, I think, a lot more impactful on the day-to-day lives of individuals than decisions that most like government officials can make. Even the president of the US, I would argue, who's traditionally supposed to be one of the most powerful people in the world, I think like probably Zuckerberg and Tim Cook and Sundar Pichai have as much, if not more, influence on the lives of day-to-day people than he does. So yeah, it's
Or
pretty
even to
complex.
potentially influence the election of said government, right? Like criticism was made to Meta earlier because of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. A lot of people make the same criticism to like of YouTube or X, formerly known as Twitter, that like these big giant platforms actually have the influence to sway people's opinion about a particular political candidate or not. And a lot of these algorithms can control what's seen, what's subverted. So you are right, like not just on the daily lives of people, but potentially just having power over the formation of the government itself. So yeah, I can see that point. So you're saying that traditionally the standard that was applied was consumer harm, but there's more to it. So what? So, and this
So the
is
benefit of the consumer harm standard is that it's actually easy to measure. And this was, I think, an innovation pioneered by the Chicago School of Economics, where they were in the 60s or 70s, something like that, where they promoted this standard. And they were like, hey, this is actually a real objective way of measuring harm and is a standard we should use rather than people, because otherwise, if you don't have a clear standard, then it just comes down to people making subjective, biased decisions based on various other motivations. So that's one of the benefits of this consumer harm standard, that is a clear, objective criteria. But often this is the challenge that maybe the thing that you can measure is not the most important thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's hard to measure the thing that you actually care about, which is like, how do I measure when a company has too much power? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I don't know.
So I am curious, what do you think are the outcomes here? Let's say, let's play that hypothetical thought experiment. So let's say
So
this
let's think about a
ruling.
narrow outcome and then like broader outcomes. Narrow outcomes is let's focus on this thing, like the Apple Google
Yeah.
arrangement.
So I want to
What,
hear your thoughts. Like, what do you think happens? Let's say this ruling sticks, and
yeah.
now Google can make this deal with Apple. Like, what do you think happens next? Does Apple provide an option every time someone searches the first time? Is like, hey, which service would you like to choose? Does Apple launch its own? I'm just
Yeah,
really.
these are actually the range of outcomes. So one is that Apple can actually make a deal with another search provider. For example, they could make a deal with Bing for Bing to become the default, Microsoft's Bing. And that actually is not illegal because
Because they don't
Microsoft,
have the
yeah, does not have
market
a
power.
monopoly.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
it's illegal for a monopolist to make this type of exclusive deal, but for a non-monopolist, it's not. But actually, one thing that was leaked was that some Apple executive said that, hey, there's no amount of money Microsoft could pay us to make Bing the default because I think the implication is that they think it sucks so
It's not
much.
as, yeah, it's not as good, which is an interesting point, right? Like, which is what I was saying earlier. Now, this might force Apple to do something which is detrimental to Apple users. So Apple was in such a good position because not only were Apple users getting the best search experience, arguably, right? I would say Google search is the best
Yeah,
search out there. I think most
for
people would
sure.
agree. But they were getting paid $20 billion to do so. This is the best
Yeah.
deal in the world. So now, if they're forced to like get rid of this deal, like this is a detrimental experience to Apple users. Yeah, it's interesting.
So either they make another deal, that's one option, seems unlikely, or they can build their own search, which again, I don't know if
It's not
they
easy.
have the appetite for that, or they just present a choice screen to all the users. And the choice screen also actually, I think, raises interesting dynamics, which is well, which option do you show first? When you say here's a choice of all the options you can use, whichever is the first one, probably like a lot of users will just pick that. And can you pay to be like the first in the list
Right,
instead of paying
right.
to be the default? I don't know. These details will have to get ironed out. But I think it's interesting to think about this in the context of AI because it seems that Apple was heading towards a similar strategy for AI. And now maybe they will have to rethink that. um, I mean,
I
I'm
have an
not sure.
interesting, yeah, I have a thought, like a prediction. Maybe what Apple can do here is become like a perplexity. So I don't know if this would fall under the ruling, but they could use Google's search rankings API the way Perplexity does and become a search engine where they don't have to invest in all the hard work of searching, like ranking and indexing, but just summarize based on the ranking that output that they get from the API. So basically, Apple could become a perplexity. Um,
Yeah. Actually, I heard some people propose that Apple should just buy Perplexity. That they could go acquire Perplexity, and that would have a
that would be a
similar.
good move for Apple, actually. Yeah, just acquire Perplexity. That would be a good
Yeah.
experience as well. Integrate that with Apple Intelligence for search. So basically, anytime someone asks,
So
and the
this is a
orchestrator could do,
version. This is a version of Apple building their own search then, and building their
yeah,
own AI and combining AI
yeah,
with
yeah,
search.
yeah.
So it's instead of build, they're like buying. Either one is fine. But yeah, I think that's an interesting strategy for Apple to pursue rather than. I think that this will harm them in the long run if they keep outsourcing these like core capabilities, especially AI, which I think is going to become more and more important. I think they likely want to have more of that capability in-house and not outsource it for this type of deal. But yeah, I don't know. And the other implication that's worth noting is what happens to Google. And there's been talk of maybe Google being broken up into multiple companies, which we touched upon at the start
Yeah,
of the
that part
episode.
I don't understand. How is breaking up Google a solution to like search monopoly? Like you or well, depends on how the breakup is being thought about. Do you have any insights into like what does that even mean? Breaking up Google? Like, is it
Yeah, I think the
to separate from?
concern here is that they're leveraging their monopoly position in one market to get an unfair advantage in other markets. That's the main concern that
Give me an
they're a
example.
like they're a monopoly in search, and they're using that to, let's say, gain dominance in like video as a market, like YouTube, for example, because they can say for advertisers, it's just really easy. If you're already advertising on Google, I'll integrate all the YouTube advertising to you, and like then that's like unfair in the video space. Um, because these guys are already like so dominant in one market, and they're leveraging that to gain dominance in the other market.
So
So
this whole case that's going on, treating Google as a monopoly, this isn't this. There's many different facets to it, is what you're saying. There's the Apple search deal facet, then there's the one business advantaging another business
mhm.
within Google. Okay, okay.
Yeah, these
So
are all like the implications of what you cannot do once you're a monopolist. Once you're a
right,
monopolist, you cannot try to retain your monopoly status through making exclusive deals. You
right.
cannot leverage that monopoly status to go and try and gain dominance over a different market. So that's why these are some of the solutions being proposed. It's very early stages right now. I think we should just wait and watch and see what happens. But yeah, maybe thinking about AI, one of the things we've been talking about from the beginning about AI is whether AI is providing new opportunities for new companies to rise up and gain market share, or whether it's just empowering existing incumbent companies to further entrench their dominance. And so far, it kind of looks like it's the incumbents are the ones that are winning with AI,
Yeah.
and that's been I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that, but I think this is further like solidifying that case that so far AI it's been something that big companies are able to get more value from, and we haven't really seen that much AI value creation from smaller companies.
Do you think there is a possibility that one of these companies will make such a powerful AI model that it would be nationalized or something? Like, do you think that's in the realm of possibility?
I have no idea. I mean, probably in
Because,
China,
I
if
mean, to
that
the point you
happens,
were
yeah.
making, to the point you were making earlier, like Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai, Tim Cook having more influence on people's day-to-day lives than even the president of the United States, who's traditionally thought of as the most powerful person on earth. Like this power will only get more influential with more and more powerful models. So um, yeah, I wonder where that goes. Like, is it enough to break these companies up, or like should the government control a super powerful multimodal model that can smell and taste or what? I don't know.
I don't
Um,
know, man. Like, I don't really want like Donald Trump or Kamala Harris being like in charge of this, like more so than like Zuck, for example, or like, Sundar Pichai. But I mean, of course, this is very complex. They are like democratically elected, whichever one of them comes into power, and there are checks and balances on them. But it's a really hard question. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. Wow. Interesting. Like there's, it's very, very, like I say this in every episode, but I feel like um, that there is a theory that we're living in a simulation, and there's so many different explanations that are given for this theory. One of them is that what are the chances that we are witnessing the most interesting time in human history ever? So I do
Hmm.
believe that. And the reason I do believe that is like all of these developments that are happening right in front of our eyes, I do think that these make for the most interesting time ever in human history. Or maybe that's just a bias that every human has had. Like maybe someone who was witnessing agricultural revolution, like this is crazy. This is the most interesting thing ever. So who knows? But like, yeah, I don't know
Well,
where.
but even the example you gave was like agricultural revolution. So if you look at these revolutions, there haven't been that many of those in human history,
Yeah,
like agriculture, industry, computers, and so we're definitely living through one of the more interesting revolutions and times of change. And I think the pace of change is just so much faster now than like I think one example that's often given is go to any time in history and think about if a person from 100 years ago was transported into your world today, like how new would it be? How surprised would they be? And I think today that surprise factor is
Mhm.
way higher than at any other time in human
Yeah,
history.
for sure. And it's going to be, and to your point, it's the way it's accelerating. That surprise factor might be true for us within our generation.
Hmm.
Like you use the 100-year time span. It
Yeah.
could be that just 25 years down the line, if someone went into a coma right now and
Yeah.
woke up 20 years down the line, I think their head would spin more than like a 100-year experiment, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I hope we can record another podcast like this 25 years later and compare it to
No, that's what
what
I
it
like
was.
about our podcast, and maybe this is a good to know, end on, is like we're documenting through our conversation this very, very interesting thing that's evolving in front of our eyes. And it's like no one knows what's going to happen. One thing I know for sure is someone's claiming like this is exactly how this will shape up. They're full of BS. Like this is
Yeah.
just so hard to predict. So it's just interesting because it's all bets are off. No one knows what's happening, but it's very, very interesting nonetheless.
Actually, one last thing I want to share on that note is I have like I can't reveal exactly who, but like I've heard many like AI leaders in this space like say very explicitly, like guys, we have no idea right now what the future is going to look like. And the comparison, I think Peter Thiel is the one who made this comparison. It's like we are in the early days of what the internet was in the 1990s. Like everyone knew that this is huge and is going to have like a lot of implications, but no one in the 1990s had any idea what like 2020 would look like and what the internet would bring. So I
Yeah.
think most people recognize that that's where we are right now with AI. Everyone knows it's huge, but no one knows exactly, in what way it's going to impact us. So yeah, we're not alone. I think that there's no one out there who has
Yeah.
these answers. Yeah.
But I am looking forward to documenting this,
Yeah.
hopefully every week with you,
Yeah.
like as we are like witnessing this very, very interesting phenomenon unfold in front of our eyes.
Yeah. Well, this was a super interesting conversation. Thank you. Thank you to all of our listeners who are still here with us. If you're still listening, please make sure to leave us a rating and review in whatever app you're using right now to listen to this and send us your comments and feedback.
All right. Have a good day, Nikhil.
Okay. See
Bye.
ya.